There are some of the things in our daily life that we don't realize how important they are until they're missing. They may have a nail file at the bottom of your purse or in the back of a drawer, or I keep one in the glove compartment of my car, and I don't ever think about it until I break a nail. And then we start digging through our purses or looking through the drawer or looking up in your car trying to find, I know I had one, where is it? Looking for it. It suddenly has taken on great significance. Or especially in our urban areas, we pass gas station after gas station after gas station, and we rarely think about all of those gas stations until our light comes on and our buzzer starts to beep and we think, uh-oh, I forgot to get gas. And we begin looking around, and suddenly all of those gas stations that were there before are nowhere to be seen. I almost wanted to say I've never run out of gas, but I don't want to say that. But I've come close. I have coasted into the gas station on fumes. Sometimes my 15-gallon tank takes 15 and a half or maybe close to 16 gallons. But we don't think about that until we run out of gas. There are things in our life that we just take for granted, and even sometimes we take our friends for granted. And we know that they're there, and we know that we enjoy being around them, but we don't really think about it until maybe they go away on a vacation, or maybe they move, and we think, oh, I want to call so-and-so, and that person isn't there. And we think, oh, can't wait for her to get back, for him to come back, so I can tell them about all the things that have been happening or get their advice. We don't think about those people around us. Well, Paul's talking about that somewhat in his passage from the book of 2 Corinthians. This is his second letter to the church at Corinth, and I shared with you last week that Paul was the founder of that particular church. He had gone to Corinth on a missionary mission, and he had established that church, and it's primarily Gentiles, non-Jews that are in that church. And although Paul was the founder, he moved on then to plant is what the word we use now, church planting. He went on to plant other churches. You know, for most of our congregations, we don't remember the founding pastors of our congregations, because most of our congregations, in fact, all of our current congregations in the partnership are between 125 and 175 years old. So none of those original members, none of those original pastors are still remaining. But when I served at the Baldwin Community Church, Baldwin Community their founding pastor was a man named Dave Wynn, who some of you may know that name. And Dave was still alive and was still had retired by the time I got to Baldwin. But people still remembered him and remembered the things that he had taught or things that he had said. Well, what's happening in the Corinthian church is that there are other people that have come in now that Paul has moved on, and they're trying to get the people to give allegiance to them, to follow their leadership instead of following the leadership of Paul. And so they have been bragging about the visions or about the revelations that they have received. And if you notice, sometimes people say, why do we pick the hymns that we pick? And they're asking that not because they're excited about it, but they're not very excited about it. But the second verse of this hymn says, I ask no dream, no prophet ecstasies, no sudden rending or tearing of the veil of clay, no angel visitant, no opening skies, but take the dimness of my soul away. I chose that particular hymn because it summarizes what Paul begins talking about, because there are people who come in and have tried to impress the congregation with the visions and with the ecstasies that they have received by the Holy Spirit. And they're trying to say that they're better, they're closer to God, they're more religious than Paul was because they've had these experiences. And Paul says, and the reason I read that opening verse, verse 1 says, it is necessary to boast. Nothing is to be gained by it, but I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. Paul's saying that, okay, I've had these experiences also. I've had these moments of visitation, and he tells in the third person about a man 14 years ago being taken up to paradise. And the word paradise is a Persian word that meant a walled garden of the king. The king, when the palace grounds, it had a walled garden, and the king would invite his closest friends, his closest associates to come and be in that garden with him and have intimate conversations there with them. And so Paul says he's been taken up, Paul has been taken up into paradise where he had an opportunity to be in intimate contact with God. And he talks about that, and he talks about the value of that. But what he says is that he doesn't say this to boast, that he doesn't want to talk about those visions or those revelations that he's had. And we aren't quite sure when this happened. It may have been when Paul was on the road to Damascus. Do you remember his conversion experience where Paul is the persecutor of the Christians under the name of Saul, and he's going to Damascus where there's a cell of Christians, a gathering of Christians, and Paul has been given permission by the Roman authorities to go and to kill those Christians. But while he's making his way there, God appears to him in a bright light, and he falls down on the ground, and he's struck blind, and he was blind for 3 days. And we don't know if that's when this visionary experience took place. But Paul says, you know, I've had these experiences, and I've had these opportunities, but he said that isn't what's important. And he stops talking about these experiences or describing them, and he says that he was given a thorn in the flesh. A thorn in the flesh. Now, the Greek word that's translated here as thorn actually should be called a stake. Now, a thorn, you know, most of us have had like a thorn from a rose bush or maybe a crab tree or something. I was reminded my dad was trimming a crab tree one day, and he cut off a branch, and it fell with such a force that it drove a thorn into his skull. I was thinking about that, and I was thinking like, man, that must have really, really hurt. Well, Paul's talking about an experience that was extremely painful, not just like a little thorn that you might get in your hand or in your foot or something, but something that, you know, through your skull, or something that is extremely painful, and pain that didn't go away. You know, we've all had headaches, and we've all had backaches and other physical trouble, but usually they go away eventually. But Paul's talking about something that was so painful that it was a constant pain for him, and he didn't have pain management or didn't go to any of the pain clinics. You know, and many of us here have had those kinds of experiences, whether it be backaches or other kinds of pain where maybe surgery didn't help. I thought about Tom, and Tom went through very trying time and continues to with his knee replacement and all of that, and went to the pain clinic, right? I had to, you know, they didn't quite get, they're thinking about that. So, you know, having those experiences where people can learn maybe through medication, but maybe through meditation, focusing on the Word of God and prayer and praying that God will take that pain away. And Paul prayed 3 times, he said, for God to take that away. And knowing what I know about Paul's prayer life, it wasn't, dear God, take this pain away. But Paul would have spent hours praying that God would remove that pain from him. But God didn't. And you know, we get frustrated by that. Even if we just have a headache for a couple hours or something, we get frustrated by that pain. And I think I've mentioned before that particularly those of us who live in Pittsburgh are so used to being able to cure everything. You know, Betty brings up about a friend who's going to have a hip replacement, and you know, that's pretty commonplace these days. And we, you know, in my mind, immediately, okay, so 3 to 4 days after surgery, about 2 or 3 hours after surgery, they get you up and start you walking. And you know, there's no, I can remember years ago, and you'll know how many years ago, I was about 14 or 13 or 14, my grandmother fell and broke her hip and was in a hospital bed in her home for 6 weeks. She never got out of bed, and I stayed there with them to help take care of her. Now she would be for about 6 minutes, and then she'd be up and moving. And so we get these pains, and we become very frustrated because they don't go away. But Paul talks about this, what he calls his thorn in the flesh, as something that God has given him for a reason. And Paul never says what that is. And there's been speculation that maybe because he had been struck blind, that maybe he had severe headaches from that blindness, or maybe he had another deformity of some kind, or maybe he had trouble seeing after that experience. We don't know what that is, because for Paul, it's not important what that pain is, what that thorn is, what that obstacle, if you will, or what that handicap, if you will, isn't important. Because after he prayed those 3 times, God finally answered that prayer, and God didn't answer it by taking the pain away. You know, when you and I pray, we often say, okay, God, here's the situation, here's what needs to be done, and here's the timetable that you need to get it done on, right? We've got this, all laid out, what we think ought to happen. But God functions as God in his own way. And so God responds to Paul, and he says, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you. Sufficient meaning enough, meaning adequate. Sufficient is when we should stop eating at the table, when we have had sufficient, not when we have eaten more than is good for us, more than we're used to eating. And I laughed about this last night, because one of the things I do is I bake sweet potatoes. I bake them a batch at a time, and then I have them in the freezer, and I pull one out, and I can throw it in the microwave, and I have this wonderful baked sweet potato to eat. Well, I usually buy those at Aldi's, because Aldi has smaller sweet potatoes. Sometimes at Giant Eagle or Shop and Save, it's enough to feed an army in that one sweet potato. And they're cheaper at Aldi's. Let me just throw that in there. So the last bag I got, though, had some bigger ones in it. So I pulled one out last night, and it was much bigger than I usually eat. And I thought, well, that's okay. I didn't have much for lunch. I'll eat this. So I fixed it, and I had it on the plate, and I realized that it was huge. It filled my whole little salad plate. And so I took half of it and put it in the refrigerator. I was going to have sufficient with half of that. God says, my grace is sufficient. It's enough. It's what you need. It's not less than you need. It's not more than you need. But my grace, God's love, God's mercy is sufficient. And he said, in fact, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That God's power is made perfect in weakness. Now, the Greek word perfect is a word teleos, and that's a word that means intended purpose. That when Paul talks about being made perfect, when John Wesley, who is the founder of Methodism, talks about us going on to perfection, he's not talking about us becoming sinless. What he's talking about is that we are made perfect. We are living out the intended purpose for us. And so that intention, and each of us have a different intention. Some are firefighters, some are teachers, some have deal with numbers, some of us do other kinds of things. That we each have our own particular purpose, and we are made perfect when we live out that purpose. And God says, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect. Power is living out what it's intended to do in weakness. Now that sounds strange for us. I mean, weakness is we avoid weakness. We don't like weakness. When somebody is weak, we say, well, there's something wrong with them. And we try to build them up. We try to get them stronger, or maybe they're weak in something else. But what God's talking about here is that we see God's power, we receive God's grace within our own weaknesses. Because the truth is that for most of us, we don't think about God when things are going along well. When the cars are running fine, and our work's going well, and our family's all healthy, and it's not raining on that rare occasion, and everything is going well, and we think, okay, yeah, thanks God for the day. All right, and I'm off. But it's when we acknowledge those weaknesses that we have, and we all have some kind of weakness. And Paul says that those visions and those revelations that he received are insignificant compared to God's power made known in his life in his weaknesses. And for Paul, he's talking about that thorn in the flesh. And that he learns to deal with that thorn in the flesh. He learns to accept it. He learns to work around it because of God's grace. So Paul's talking about, not everybody has these visions. It's what our song, Spirit of God descend upon my heart, is recognizing that most of us don't have those kinds of otherworldly experiences. Most of us don't have those major revelations, but it's in our day-to-day living that God's grace is shown to us. that God's power and grace is shown as we acknowledge our own weakness. I always like to use Gus as, Gus always gives me something to use in a sermon illustration. The addictions that Gus is talking about, people can only overcome that by the grace of God. And he said that he's overcome it by the grace of God and the prayers of this congregation and the prayers of others. And that's what's true in all of our lives, whatever those issues are. We may not have addictions. We may not be addicted to substance addictions, but we may have addictions to other things. There are all kinds of addictions, and there are all kinds of thorn in the flesh. For some of it, that thorn in the flesh may be physical. It may be something that we have to deal with, a limitation that we have, or something that we're not able to overcome, and we need to learn our limits. We need to learn what we can do and what we can't do. And it's God's grace that comes and encourages us in the midst of those weaknesses to become stronger in our faith, to be made perfect through God's grace. Some of you cheered me on last Saturday at the Brentwood Firecracker 5K. It was just a year ago, it was just last September, last September that I ran my first 5K. Never in my entire life did I think I would. Never did I want to. I never saw a reason to do that, but I've worked in the last 2 years to become stronger, to become healthier, to become more physically fit so that I could be healthier. And so I've had to be challenged by my trainer, Christy Davini, some of you remember Christy, and by other coaches to push myself a little bit further, push myself a little bit more. So I hope that in 4th of July of 2016, I only walk up 2 hills instead of 3, making becoming stronger. It's in that, the weakness is I'm old and not able to get up those rocks, those hills. But I also have to tell you that I'm 20 pounds lighter than I was the first race that I ran, which also makes a reason why I ran faster, because I wasn't as much as me running. It was great to not have to carry so much up those hills. Maybe next year there'll be less. But we have those obstacles that we overcome by God's grace, and it's truly by God's grace, and that I've stuck with it, because there have been days that I've not wanted to. It's easier. I wanted to eat that whole potato. I wanted to not work out, but because of God's grace, I've continued to do that. So sometimes it's our physical needs. Sometimes they're in our relationships. Sometimes our thorn in the flesh, and some of you have talked, none of you have, but other people talk about somebody being their cross to bear or their thorn in the flesh, or the person who drives them nuts. And most of us have those people in our lives. And so we learned through God's grace to know that we can't change those persons. We can't change anybody else's behavior. And again, that's one of the tenets of the 12-step programs, is that the only person that can change that person is the person with God's help. That we can't do it for them. As much as those family members want to make it different, as much as they want to change the life of someone else, the only person that we can change is ourselves. And sometimes we're so busy trying to change somebody else's life that we forget that perhaps there might be something in our own lives that needs to change. When we recognize those weaknesses, when we recognize our limitations, that we can't change the life of someone else, and there's a family, maybe a family member or a friend that, they're just on a path of self-destruction, and so we either choose to go down that path with them or say, no, that's where you're going, but I'm not going there. And as a parent, it's difficult for parents to say, I want to rescue my child. I want to fix it for them. And it's hard to stop and say, no, I'm not going to do that. And I use the word enabling, that we get caught up in all of that. And so there are thorns in our flesh that we don't have control over, and we can only deal with that through God's grace in our own lives and in our own opportunity. And so God gives us that grace to overcome those obstacles. The gospel lesson from Mark talks about Jesus coming in human form, and Jesus came in a form that we would understand, and Jesus shared all of our emotions and feelings, and the things that we go through came in that human form. And this little passage reminds us that Jesus was rejected in his hometown, that even the prophets who were hailed in other places were often rejected in their own hometown. And the passage talks about somebody saying, isn't that the carpenter's son? You know, isn't this his mother and brothers and sisters that are here? Who does he think he is? Rejecting Jesus because of past relationship maybe. But we are reminded that even as he was rejected and as he hurt physically and as he cried at the death of his friend Lazarus, that he has experienced all the emotions that we have and all the experiences of life that we've had. Jesus has had those as well and understands those and gives us the sufficient grace to overcome those when we go to God and ask God for grace to help us to do that. I want to close with a quote and see if you know who said this. This person said, I thank God for my handicaps. I thank God for my handicaps because through them I have found myself, my work, and my God. I thank God for my handicaps because through them I have found myself, my work, and my God. Anybody know who said that? Helen Keller, exactly. A woman who was born without hearing or speaking or seeing. And we all have watched the, what's that movie called? Miracle. Thank you. Miracle Worker. Well, how her life was changed by the grace of God. And Anne Sullivan coming into her life and God putting people there. God's grace is sufficient for us. For God's power is made perfect in our weakness. Amen.